Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome this afternoon to the book launch of Dr. Yeo Kang Shua's book, Divine Custody, A History of Singapore's Oldest Teochew Temple. My name is Yew Foong, and I'm an associate professor with the Hong Kong Shue University. I've been asked to be discussant for this book, but I will bring to this discussion more of an anthropology and sociological angle. Because I'm not really an architectural historian, but it also shows the implications of Kang Shua's book goes beyond just architectural history. I'll also be doubling up as moderator for this today's book launch, as Dr. Lai Chikian, the original moderator, could not join us today. Let me just give a quick introduction of Kang Shua. Most of you who have decided to join this book launch will have known him. He is Associate Pillar Head and Associate Professor of Architectural History, Theory and Criticism at the Singapore University of Technology and Design, and is also currently the President of ICOMOS Singapore. Now, Kang Shua has been involved in 3 separate projects that has won the UNESCO Asia Pacific Heritage Awards. We are very pleased that today he can join us for this book launch and to share with us a bit more about his book. Now, Kang Shua, if you know him, is a very knowledgeable person, and if you go on tours with him, he will be able to tell you stories about the temples, stories about the buildings, and in terms of their materials and their history. And this sort of stands out also in his book on divine custody. You will feel that it's almost as if Kang Shua is speaking to you through the book itself, and his whole persona comes alive through the book. So I'm glad that today we will have him later on to share with us from his book. And along the way, if you have questions, please feel free to post them in the commentary column, whether you're on Facebook or Instagram or some other platforms. Right now, we will go on to this part where we launch the book. Okay, there you have it with the virtual fanfare. The book is officially launched. Right now, we will hand the time over to Kang Shua, who will share with us some of his thoughts on the book. Kang Shua, please, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Yew Foong. Thank you for the wonderful introduction and for the launch of the book. I would like to thank everyone for attending this virtual webinar and book launch. Thank you for spending your afternoon with me and Yew Foong. First and foremost, I would like to thank the organizers of this virtual book launch, my publisher, NUS Press, Hong Kong Shue University, as well as my department, the Architecture and Sustainable Design at the University of Technology and Design. I would like to start off with an acknowledgement to all the people that helped me in this journey in preparation of the book. This journey has taken me slightly over 10 years. And at every stage of research and working on this book, I've enjoyed many enthusiastic support from many colleagues, friends, and families. So first and foremost, I would like to thank the Nian Kongsi and Wak Hai Cheng Bio Restoration Committee led by Mr. Jamie Teo. It is this restoration project that really ignited the idea that the book should be written on the temple, which I will talk a little bit more about how the book came about later. I'm also indebted to a lot of people. Without them, it wouldn't be possible for me to write the book. The many craftsmen that was involved in the restoration projects, my dialogue to them, and they are actually my teachers on the traditional construction techniques. I'm also very grateful to our restoration committee secretary, Ms. Tan Siu Ing of the Nian Kongsi, and Mr. Chan Chi Wai, which is the site supervisor, who have provided administrative and technical assistance on site. I also have to thank many of my research assistants, Martina Yo, Sun Tzu Speechley, who have very provided tremendous help in trying to suss out a lot of obscure historical information. I also owe a debt of gratitude to Mr. Kwa Chung Wan, who for his encouragement and his very, very much interest in my book, and to Dr. Kevin Tan for editing the manuscript. I also like to thank all the anonymous reviewers for their very lucid insight and criticism that helped to improve my manuscript. And last but not least, the team at NUS Press, Mr. Peter Shopper, Lindsay Davis, Ms. Anna Teochew, and of course, our producer for today's webinar, Sana. This book is also made possible with a grant from the National Heritage Board, so I would like to put it on record. Thank you, National Heritage Board, for providing a grant that made this book possible. Last but not least, I would like to thank my remarkable wife, Shue, who has been with me throughout this whole entire journey of the production of this book. Without further ado, I'll start my slideshow and I'll do a little presentation and bring you everyone through how the book got started. It was actually in 2007 when I first encountered the temple. One day in 2007, I received a phone call from a secretary at the Nian Kongsi informing me that a piece of sculpture fell out from the roof truss of the temple. Right? And so on the left image, it shows you where exactly is that roof ornamentation, which is under the beam, the black colored beam. On the image on the right, you have the shattered piece of ornamentation. And that started my first foray into trying to understand the history of the temple, the Wak Hai Cheng Bio. Right. So when the temple secretary in the temple restoration committee invited me to restore the building as part of the team in 2010, one of the first things that we have to do is to understand the history of the building. So I started to do some research, and majority of the research materials are secondary sources. Unfortunately for this Chinese temple, the Teochew temple, unlike other Chinese temples in Singapore, we do not have a historic stone stele that inscribe the historic founding of the temple, right? So we have even secondary records that claim that the temple is founded in the 18th century. Okay, you have the full screen right now. So most of the historical information that we have on hand then was based on secondary records, right? So here I have a listing of secondary records, and there's a several question mark on the information that we have. Some claims that there is a rebuilding. The building was constructed in the 18th century, 1738, and there was a rebuilding of the temple in 1836, and that is unconfirmed. But what we do for sure know for sure, is that we have an 1895 building plan, right? So this is the 1895 architecture building plan that was submitted to the municipal engineer for the reconstruction of the temple. And it was this plan that actually provided a lot of very interesting information in the specification that's written on the right of the plan, which includes the usage of tropical timber. So this is an image of that we generally believe to be the oldest surviving photograph of the temple. And one of the clue to the date of the building is the man who is still wearing a pigtail. And the architectural format collaborate with the architectural plan in 1895. So this is the other surviving historic photograph that we have. This is an image from the 1960s. Along Phillip Street, very bustling hawkers selling things. If you go through the entrance gateway, you can see quickly on the left-hand side, there is a structure behind the entrance gateway. That is the opera stage that is being temporarily erected in the courtyard of the temple. And so here you have on the left, you have the courtyard temple, and this is a 1960s photograph. And on the right, you have a 1994 photograph of the temple in the courtyard. Here we have an aerial photograph, two aerial photographs, an aerial photograph showing on the left before the 1994 restoration, and on the right after the 1994 restoration. As an architectural conservator, in order to restore the building well, we have to understand the history of the building, right? But there's a lot of questions that will remain unanswered. For example, who were the people who founded the temple? When was the temple originally established and was constructed, right? But we know that the temple at the current site, in its current iteration, date back to 1895 because we have an 1895 building plan. And although there are a lot of questions were left unanswered, for example, like the one I mentioned earlier, it doesn't inhibit the restoration process. So the earlier image shows that before the restoration, and this current cutaway axonometric shows what was done after the restoration. The following slides, I will bring you through what was done during the restoration. And this is a photograph taken when the roof is taken down for us to inspect the timber purlins piece by pieces as they were installed using mortise and tenons. We're able to dismantle them, inspect them for any termite damages or water damages before putting back them again. This is a ceremony known as the beam raising ceremony. The beam raising ceremony is a very important ceremony for Chinese timber craftsmen. It was this ceremony that will signify that the building is indeed a building and not just a pile of timber or stones or bricks, right? And historically, we also know that the Wak Hai Cheng Bio carried out beam raising ceremony during the 1895 reconstruction. This image shows a painter trying to do finishing touches to one of the door god panels, right? And this is a artisan doing restoration to the qianci or ceramic ornamentation of the dragons on the ridge of the roof of the temple. This is another artisan working on the ridge of the temple. And this is the completed roof scape on the temple. A close-up of the ceramic ornamentations. A painter painting and restoring a very quintessential Teochew gold gilding on a beam, right? A fresco painter restoring a fresco on the front elevation of the temple. Right, and this is a general look on the restored interior of the temple and the front elevation of the temple. So beyond the restoration, I would like to talk a little bit more about the book itself, how it came about, right? As I mentioned earlier, during the restoration and throughout the whole entire process of restoration, several questions remains in my mind with regards to this particular temple. When was it established? By whom it was established, right? And why this location? And we started to research a lot of historic maps. And this is one example of a map. It's dated 1846 by John Turnbull Thompson. And in this particular map, you will see that the one encircled in red, it states Joss House. But of course, this particular map, the interest of the surveyor is not in the temple itself. So the Joss House location is just indicative. It doesn't really show the footprint of the temple. By hard work of my team of researchers, we managed to come across one particular cadastral map. Cadastral map is different from the maps that we've seen earlier, the one in 1846. Cadastral map is made for, in a way, land administration, right? For taxation to administer land. So cadastral map shows the building boundary very, very clearly. And in this particular cadastral map entitled Land Division at Phillip Street, circa 1830 to 1890, we had a very interesting entry. And this cadastral map, the point interest is not on the Chinese temple, it's on the building that's next to the temple. But on the temple site, which I underscore in red here, it states crown land occupied by the Chinese temple. Right? So this particular cadastral map actually throws out even more questions, right? Why did Wak Hai Cheng Bio, the oldest Teochew temple, occupying crown land, right? Which crown lands means that the land theoretically belongs to the British monarch. An answer came to us several years later during one of the research that we found a record in the British Library. And this is a land register of land on the grants in the new form established by Mr. Crawford circa 1846 to 1848. And on the land grant number 174, which is a Wak Hai Cheng Bio, right, it is stated that to whom it was granted is granted to Tua Lao Ya Kyong. Right? Tua Lao Ya is a common reference to the patron deity of the Teochew, the Shen Tian Sang Di. Lao Ya, it means deity, right? Tua is big, so it's the big deity. And the big deity is Shen Tian Sang Di, right? Kyong is actually transliterated from the Hokkien of King, or it means temple. So it's Tua Yao, the temple of the Tua Lao Ya. And the land area also coincide very well, collaborated very well with the land occupied by Wak Hai Cheng Bio. And we have a quick rent of $3 Spanish. But what's interesting is in the remarks, it says none received. Right? So what had happened was that someone in the owners or trustees of Tua Lao Ya King, right, did not pay the annual quit rent of $3 Spanish, which then led it to administratively receded the land back to the crown property. Some other maps that is of interest to us. This is a 1842 map and was surveyed by the government surveyor. And in this particular map, the interest of the surveyor is to map up the lot boundary, the land lot. And you will notice the red circle that I circle in, it says Chinese temple. But please note that the lot is not enclosed lot, right? All other lots in this particular map are enclosed. That means all the lines or enclosed to form a shape that defines the boundary of the land. But in this particular case, the land of the Chinese temple, which is Wak Hai Cheng Bio, is open on the Phillip Street site. So again, why is this so? All right, is it just merely that the surveyor forgot to draw a line, which is quite unlikely? So through our efforts in trying to understand the land records, one of the things that my team and I did is that we tried to go through all the land history records of all the properties owned by Nyan Gongxi, right? So fortunately for us, there is a document dated 1914, which is actually a court case, a suit case. So we applied to the Supreme Court Singapore to access their archives, and it's called suit number 430 of 1914. And in this particular suit number 430 of 1914, it has a list of properties owned or claimed by Nyan Gongxi. And so we actually took the list of properties and we start to do a kind of a property record regression exercise. So we trace back the property and we trace back the ownership of the lands. And here I showed you a couple of images of cadastral drawings, which my team and I put together and superimposed on today's modern maps. Right? And all this information actually led us to have sufficient information to write about the early history of this particular temple, the Wak Hai Cheng Bio. So the book is actually structured in a chronological way, although that the process of working out and writing the book is chronological, right? I started off with the 2010 to 2014 restoration, pending after the restoration, right? There are a lot of questions that remains in my mind, right? And we started to dig up more information on the history of the temple properties. Beyond the narrative of the book, I also included 8 box stories, right, that helps us understand a little bit more about this temple. Right? It started with toponomics because I do believe that toponomics on the temple as well as its environment, which forms a 2-box story, does inform us about the early social structure and understanding of the heritage landscape. I also included one box story on the early land administration system in Singapore, and it's indeed through understanding the land records, the land transactions, that this particular book on the social history can be written. I also included one box story on the earliest imperial plaque that was presented to Singapore, the Chinese Singapore, and over a lot of secondary records, secondary resources. The date of this particular plaque is in dispute, and I tried to answer that question. There's also a box story on founding of the Guangdong Huiguang, right, the Cantonese association, which was founded within the temple. And this was, it comes to us as a surprise, is because during the restoration in the 2010, when clearing out the storeroom of the temple in the rear annex block, a metal plaque, which is shown here, the left-hand image, a lower left-hand image, was found in the storeroom. And on this metal plaque, it was instructed that it belongs to the Guangdong Huiguan, the Cantonese association, and it has a history of written in it that talk about the founding of the Huiguan in the temple. And I try to understand why the Cantonese association was founded in the Teochew temple. I also included a box story on the Teochew architecture in Singapore and what is Teochew architecture. And then we'll have the last 2 box stories talk about the land acquisition exercise of SIT, the Singapore Improvement Trust, on the back street of Phillip Street that has implication to the temple. Last but not least, I included one more technical of interest box story that talked about the competitive team construction technique that was used by the temple builders in 1895. So in this image, lower right-hand corner image, you can see that the roof truss on the left and on the right, there's some slight differences. Leading up to this book launch, I also have shared in various social media various teasers and snippets of history of the Wak Hai Cheng Bio. There was, these are 5 examples that I showed here. For example, what is the relationship between Wak Hai Cheng Bio and Yang Kongsi, right? And I also talk about the earliest recorded name of temple is not Wak Hai Cheng Bio, but Tua Lao Ya Pyong, right? I also talk about the crown properties and also about the predecessors of Niang Gongxi, for example, Jiang Tian Xiang Di Gongxi, Yun Yan Xiang Di Gongxi, Wan Xian Xiang Di Gongxi, and then also about Bang Xi Sun Gongxi. And all these Gongxis have a role to play in the history of the building. Right. So this is a very short sharing of the origins and my journey in writing the book. Without further ado, I would like again to thank the various parties that has been involved in helping me coming out with the book, but Niang Gongxi, the NUS Press editorial and layout team, as well as many my researchers and photographers that helped me with the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kang Shua. I suppose I'm live now, and I'm supposed to be the discussant and to share my thoughts on this book. In looking through the book again and in hearing Kang Shua talk about the work that went into the book, I do wonder if I'm qualified to actually comment on this book. Thinking of the multiple sources that were gone into is really impressive. And I asked myself, could I have researched and written a book like this? I think not, because you have to have really a very diverse set of skills to really put this book together, to be bilingual, and not just that, but to know the various Chinese dialects, Teochew, Hokkien, to not just be able to put together a narrative from newspapers, but also to read maps and the urban history, um, to also go into the material culture of the time and to piece things together. I think all these are not easy skills and knowledge to acquire, and it takes a lot of time to really have all these requisite skills and piece things together and bring together this book. So I would honestly say, I mean, I can't imagine myself being able to write a book like this. And so I want to congratulate you, Kang Shua, for really helping us to decipher the history of this temple through all the materials that you and your team have very painstakingly put together. And in doing this, I mean, putting all these materials together, I think you were trying to trace the history of the temple and allow me to speak not so much as a historian, but more as an anthropologist, where the question that really jumps at us as anthropologists, and I have firsthand sort of encounters with this particular question, is the question of what makes a temple, right? So I remember looking through your book, and seeing you describe how early accounts of the temple talks about there being a censor, and then that would have been the earliest sort of record of there being a temple there and all that. And indeed, that makes us think about what makes a temple. At which point do we say a temple becomes a temple? Right? And I think and that probably also sticks out as a difficult question for you to handle. And you have, like, I think, done due diligence in bringing together different kinds of materials to try to answer that question. I myself, in my field research in Indonesia, has seen how a temple started with just simply three joysticks, stuck into the ground because somebody thinks that there's a deity there that needs to be honored, and slowly they put a sensor there so that they can put the joysticks, and slowly the statuette of the deity appears under the tree, and then eventually a community evolves and emerges around the worship of the deity, and they put their resources together and they build a temple. And all this happened in the span of 1 year when I was doing my field research in West Kalimantan in Indonesia. So I mean, how temples evolve, how temples become temples is a whole process that is quite miraculous and not exactly easy to trace. And I think you have given us clues through all the historical records, and I think you have left no stone unturned in order to give us an idea of how this temple came to be. And I think the value there is that it's not just history, but it gives us for me as an anthropologist, the anthropological insight into what makes a temple, right, in that historical context. Now, then I move to my second point, which is that, as you worship the deity over time in a certain space, a community evolves out of it. And we know that a temple and a deity represents a community. But a temple is not just a space to go, and it's not just a religious space, but a communal space which a community sort of gather around, right? So we know that in China, every village will have their own temple because that is the space where the village will have all the important meetings, right? Um, and the deity, if I may use a French anthropological term, is the personification of the conscience collective, or the collective conscience of the community. It sort of brings together the collective consciousness of the community as well. And I think in reading your book, it brings out that particular perspective, right? How the temple itself has played a role for different aspects of the community, right? We know that at one point secret societies were associated with it. It was a humanitarian space during the Japanese occupation. For the Teochew, it was a communal public property and then also an administrative space, right? So we see this role being played out. And so it's very nice to see how all your historical materials are answering my anthropological questions, right? And so we see this temple not just as a historical space, not just as a heritage of the Teochew, but also a communal space that has evolved over time for the Teochew community and other communities in Singapore, which leads me to my third point, right? That the space as a communal space or otherwise is not just for the Teochew community alone, right? Because we understand that as the Teochews come to Singapore, they start to interact with other ethnic groups locally. They start to interact with other dialect groups, and you have shown us just in your last few slides, how the Cantonese Association was formed and founded in the temple itself, right? So we see how there is that interaction, right, and cultural hybridity. And remember, early in your book, in your introduction, you talking about how oftentimes the samples of Chinese architecture that we find in Southeast Asia are considered to be secondary, right? Less authentic as what we than what we see in China. But you were dissatisfied with that, right? And I think rightly so. That we in Southeast Asia we should appreciate that there will be a different interpretation or different take on Chinese culture, and that interaction between the migrants and the local context and how that become manifested in the architectural space. I think that is something that is unique for Southeast Asia, unique for the Chinese overseas, and something that I think we get to appreciate through your book. And for that matter, I think it is only meaningful to talk about Teochew Temple overseas, right? Because if you are back in the various districts in Teochew, you won't be talking about Teochew Temple because it's meaningless, right? It's only when you're in interaction with other groups of people that your positioning as a Teochew that makes sense. So this thing about social identity again is relative and something that sort of is a kind of positioning when you move overseas, right? And so I think that in this temple itself, a lot of these dynamics would be brought out, and it sort of is a microcosm, right, of all these dynamics about the Chinese diaspora that we are talking about. Now, I think we want to open the time for questions as well, but I want to take use the privilege as the moderator and discussant to sort of pose the first question to you. Now, so in the context of thinking about this as the temple of the Teochew in diaspora, how do you think this temple compares, say, to temples in the Teochew prefecture in China, and perhaps also with other Teochew temples in Southeast Asia? In what ways do you think there has been some degree of cultural hybridity, changes that are manifested as a result of adaptations locally, and what would these features be? So do you think you can enlighten us on this particular issue?
Yeah, thank you, Yew Foong, for the criticism of the book. And first, before I answer the question, I would like to apologize for technical issues that we faced earlier. So I hope that everyone can still get the gist of my presentation. So back to the question on the Teochew Temple. How do we understand Teochew Temple in Singapore and Southeast Asia? Throughout my field work in this region, as of course with regards to Wak Hai Cheng Bio, we can see two things. One thing is that the expression of the Teochew Temple historically is quintessential Teochew. They are very, very Teochew. And I said that this is not counting that subsequent, like say maybe in the 20th century or even 21st century, where people start to do changes to the temple, you alter the Teochewness of temple. So I'm, let's say, going back to when it was first rebuilt or originally built, it's actually quintessentially Teochew most of the time. But what we do see is that in the materials that was being used, there is the tendency to use local materials. Right? So, for example, before I carry out my research, I always have this question: are all the materials imported from China, as per previous accounts tell us, right? And one of the things is that, well, in Southeast Asia, we have very, very good timber species. And we know that in the Qing dynasty, the Qing government, the imperial court, actually imported timber from Southeast Asia to build their palaces in China, right? So why would that be a case whereby when we build the Chinese temple in Southeast Asia and Singapore, we would want to import timber from China, right? So this question is actually partially answered in the 1895 building plan, where it was very clearly specified that local timber is being used. There are three species of timber: Bilian, Daru, and Cantonese, that was used for the construction of the temple. So one thing is that why? Then the question is, why is it that they are in terms of outward expression, they are very, there's no doubt of it being Teochew. My understanding is that well, when migrants come to Southeast Asia, well, they want to build something that is familiar to them, right? And perhaps the Teochew believe that by building something very similar to what they have back home, right, it will bring them closer to their homeland. But in terms of the material, choice of material, they would try as much as possible to source for local materials. Having said that, there are still some materials that they have to import from China. So, for example, certain type of stones that require high relief carvings, our local stones are not good for that. They import those from China, and certain roof ornamentation materials have to be imported from China. So these are the two trends of expression, I would say, that's manifested in the physical form of the temple.
Okay, so that's interesting, because you're saying that the styles quintessentially is Teochew, which means that they will have brought craftsmen over from their homeland, right, in order to do this. So there's a kind of like mixed method here, that craftsman wise we'll keep to our own craftsmen to maintain the style, but then we could use local materials, and then that, so we see the interaction there, and I suppose the craftsman also has to get used to the local materials and see what can be done with the local materials. Would we be right to say, to come to that kind of conclusion?
In a way, yes, I would say though. Yeah, and I will even venture to say that in the earlier part of Singapore, in the 19th century, most of these craftsmen would typically be traveling craftsmen that would travel to Singapore and the region to construct buildings, to construct architecture for them.
Okay, all right. I think I shouldn't hog the limelight here. I think that there is another question from Facebook that's posed to you. Would you like to take it out? This is a question from Jerome Teo.
Okay. So the question is, the traditional Chinese temple are typically oriented in a north-south axis, unless for certain reasons that to face the coast. Why is this Teochew temple facing almost the east? I would say that the north-south axis is a conventional axis, right? And even with the Teochew temple of Wak Hai Cheng Bio here, we always refer to the symbolic east and the symbolic west, right? So we have the dragon wall and the tiger wall, right? The Zuo Qing Long Yu Bai Hu, right? And it's always represented in a temple. Okay? So it's not necessary that, not always true that the temples is orientated to the true magnetic north-south axis, right? And so why particular this Teochew temple is the facing of this particular Teochew temple? And this question is still, unfortunately, we are unable to know the real reason for this. And in front of this particular temple, what is exactly in front of the temple? In front of the temple is Raffles Square, right? You get rid of the tall buildings in front of the temple. It faces Raffles Square. And we know that Raffles Square, through the writings of the early colonial writings, is actually a swampy area, right? The swampy area that it was filled up as a reclaimed land to build up Raffles Square. So in a way, why is it facing? It's actually not facing land. It's actually facing some water swampy area. So in a way, we can also understand it as also facing a kind of ocean or water body.
Mm.
So unfortunately,
so you think this is like some sort of like a feng shui consideration?
I think feng shui would feature very strongly, but what exactly about feng shui is something that is unknown because the landscape have changed. We know that some little hill logs were cut down for land reclamation, and all these feng shui features, geographic features were changed. And another colloquial name for this particular temple is San Zai Ting Lao Ye Gong. And San Zai Ting, right, is Suan Kia Ting, which is actually refers to a little hill. And where exactly is the hill, right? So this is the kind of questions that today, unfortunately, we can't know for sure about the specific orientation of this particular temple.
Right. So we don't have so I mean you have dug up all the historical maps that could be dug out, right, with respect to the temple's environs. But you haven't seen any map that shows us the original topography of the temple's environment that will give us some clue to why the facing is as such, would it?
The earliest we call clue to the environment will be the build plan map. Mm-hmm. The build map was resurfaced maybe close to 10 years ago, right, or maybe less than 10 years ago. Does tell us a little bit about the environs of the temple. And one of the things that maybe is linked to this particular question is that and why this question it fascinated me so much, right? Especially also the question of why on the crown land. When the British started to parcellate the land out, right? And in fact, we know that this area of along the banks of Singapore River were one of the earliest land that's being sold by the British, by the East India Company, to various people, right? To merchants, to whoever want to purchase the land. The question is that was the temple land an amalgamation of many different plots of land? And we know that from the earlier cadastral and the kind of building block boundaries, the land were understood to be like the shophouse lot, right? Long and narrow. And if we take another example, the Hokkien temple, the Thiên Hock King. Thiên Hock King temple is made up of many pieces of shophouse lot land where the Hokkien merchants then purchase them and then form a larger plot of land to build Thiên Hock King in 1840, right? But so is this pattern of land acquisition similar to that of the Teochew? But interestingly, what I found is that this particular piece of land was never subdivided, right? Was never subdivided. And what does this mean? This means that it could only mean that the temple is already existing on the land before the British started to subdivide the land for sale, right? So that is one of the questions that that really fascinated me. So what exactly happened? So why would the temple exist before the British subdivided? So this in a way sought to answer some of the anecdotal accounts that states that this particular temple started off as a plantation temple, probably Gambia, right? And subsequently later it became more prominent. And when there's no more Gambia plantation, it continues to be a temple of importance to the Teochew community in Singapore.
Right. Just to pardon my ignorance, right? The question was asking about north-south axis. So would the question be referring to traditional Chinese temples in China, where they are facing south? Do you think that's what he's asking about?
Um, Probably no. Okay, so north south facing is a generic north south facing that
Mm,
most buildings would try to go generically try to adapt to. But not
mm,
all buildings, and not certainly not all temples in China are north south facing.
mm, mm, mm. Okay, okay. Now he has another question, which is from Jerome Teo as well. Why is the entrance arch not aligned to the central axis of the twin temple? Is this typical in Teochew temple architecture?
Again, this is again not typical, and
Mm,
we do not know why. Again,
mm,
why is it not in this particular case? So there's a lot of questions that are still left unanswered, and so this is
mm,
one of the beauty of this particular research that I embarking on, because there's so many
mm,
questions that is left unanswered, right? And I
mm,
will certainly hope that uh, many people could have helped to discover more historical source. But one of the things that I could even venture to as a hypothesis is that because the land size of the temple map changed over the years, right? And
mm,
if we take that the anecdotal records that it used to be a plantation temple, right?
mm,
The
mm,
form of the temple may not be the same as this 1895 temple, right? And the
mm,
boundaries may be more loose, right?
mm,
So when the temple started to have a predetermined boundary, the side boundary, with all
mm,
the other lands surrounding started to develop, right?
mm,
Then it necessitate a need to build the entrance gateway and the boundary
mm,
to
mm,
demarcate the defines of the temple.
mm, mm, mm. Yeah. So I guess a lot of these questions are, I mean, they're interesting questions, but not always easy to ask unless you were there at the founding of the temple, or you were there on site when those changes take place. Because not it's not always that all these kinds of changes or deviations from the norm are recorded properly in historical documents. So we can just all we can do is just to make a good educated guess on why that is the case. Now, another question from Jerome Teo is on the lineage of the Maju deity in this temple. Do you have any clue on that, whether it's related to Real or China?
Again, we are not very sure, right?
Mm,
Again, because the early part of the history is really unknown. Anecdotal
mm,
records say that it's the Teochew came via the rail, or some say via
mm,
Highland, right,
mm,
and not directly from China. And
mm,
I think there is certain truth to believe that possibly it comes from rail, because the
mm,
rail Gambia agriculturalist for the Teochew is actually well established before the establishment of Singapore in
mm,
1819,
mm, mm,
right? Um, and of course, some years ago, I actually wrote a conference paper on talking about the group of temple in Tanjung Pinang, right?
mm,
It's another group Teochew building. So it potentially might come from the rail, but at this moment of time, unless we have more historical records, uh, this is only, I think, possible hypothesis.
mm, mm. Okay. Do you want to take up the question on I don't know whether the question is target targeted towards me or towards you, but maybe you can um, have a try as well.
Okay, I think we
Um,
have a question of Chak Hui. Chak Hui, thank you for the questions. It really makes sense to talk about Teochew temple when overseas. I suppose that, if I'm not too sure whether you Feng, you mean that. Let's say if
mm,
I'm in Teochew, I
mm,
think a lot of the people in Teochew probably would think that that's a temple. You won't talk about it's a Teochew temple, right? And if
mm,
similarly, if you're in Hokkien, in Fujian,
mm,
uh,
mm,
that the temple is a temple, right?
Mm.
But when you start to put things of different communities together, right, then it makes sense to talk about a certain type of communities, and it happens in, for example, in the bigger cities, right? You have the different Hui Guan, right? So this is a Guangdong Hui Guan, and it typically be in the Guangdong style in Beijing, for example, right? In Beijing, you see a Guangdong building, a Guangdong Hui Guan. So that is sort of more clear to us in overseas Chinese, where we have so many different communities of different dialect groups, and hence it does. It might be strange to a Teochew in China, but when you come to Singapore, you do see a very different kind of architecture styles that are related to different dialects. So in Singapore, we can actually look at the building based on the architectural typology and the construction technique to tell what are the origins of the particular architecture.
Yeah, I guess the when I made the point, it was more related to issues of social identity. It's just like if you're in Chaozhou, right? You're not going to tell people next to you, "Hey, I'm Teochew," right? Because everyone else is Teochew. So then to speak of a Teochew temple in the Teochew prefecture itself, it kind of strange. Unless you have like you come to a place and you have someone from Chaoyang meet someone from Chaoan, right? And then you talk about your differences. Then in those cases, then you won't be talking about yourselves as Teochew, but you talk about yourselves as Chaoyang, Chaoan, right? And then so it's only that when you come overseas, or if in China you leave the Teochew homeland itself, then you begin to be able to imagine yourself in terms of a broader identity called Teochew, right? And then around that identity and the social community that sort of forms around it, then the temple evolves, right? Which then you can name and call a Teochew temple. So it's just like the same logic where it's like overseas Chinese, you see the graves will mention the hometown in China of the disease, right? But in China itself, when the grave is situated like in a cemetery just outside the village, there's no point writing down the hometown because you're already there. So I think this is a question that is linked to your where you are, the positioning, both geographically and also socially, when you're outside of the Teochew homeland itself. Now we have another question from Swati Changaka. Um, so 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 the question is, what was your biggest challenge during the writing of your book?
Okay. One of the reasons why the book took such a long time to complete, right, is that at what stage I tell myself that I have sufficient material to write a book, right? And a lot of those materials are not that easy to come by. It means that we spend, myself and my researchers, all right, spend countless of hours trawling through archival materials, reading, for example, Le Bao year to year, right, day by day, right, and trying to extract any tiny little bits of information pertaining to a temple, and trying to piece things together. And most of the time, the historical finds are actually as much as I would say accidental, they are not accidental. That we actually go through a very systematic way to trawl through the information. I think this is the challenge, the greatest challenge. How can we trawl through these sets of historical information to suss out the early history? But I think this is also one beauty, all right, of this particular research. There's so much questions I have in my mind. And up to today, since writing the book, right, there's still a lot of questions that I have in my mind.
Yeah, I think any of us who has done archival research and historical research would know that to actually find historical materials that can answer your questions is a process of 可遇不可求, right? You might accidentally come across it, but it's not like if you want to find it, you definitely find it. That's not the case. Now, I remember in our discussion, you did mention one particular interesting finding that you have, is that the there were predecessors to Nian Gongxi, right? The associations related to the temple, Nian Gongxi came later as a name for the association related to the temple, and there were other names that seem to be more related to the deity in the temple. Could you elaborate on that and sort of share with us what you think that, the reason could be for that kind of development?
Yes, I think one of the very interesting things that throughout the research is that also on the ownership, right? And today we understand that the temple is owned by Nian Gongxi, and general knowledge, right, is that claims that Nian Gongxi is founded in 1845. And in my research, sort of throws me slightly off that in fact Nian Gongxi was not founded in 1845. And there were other gongxis that preceded Nian Gongxis. And again, through current cultural practice and social practice, there's another gongxi called Bang Si Sun Gongxi, Wan Si Sun Gongsi, right? That culturally and religiously is the one responsible for the Matu celebration, the goddess of the sea celebration, while the celebration for the patron deity, Shen Sangdi, is taken care of by Nian Gongxi. But what's strangely is that throughout the land records that I managed to dig out, there's no mention of Bansi Sun Gongxi. All right. So the question is, when did Bansi Sun Gongxi came about to have a role in this particular temple? Right. So this question is still left unanswered. But today we know that Bansi Sun Gongxi still continue the practice of being responsible for the celebration of Matu's festive occasions. Right. So what are the other gongxis that we may find out? So earlier on one of my slides, I showed the earliest English name of the temple is Tua Lao Ya King, right? The temple of the great deity, right? And that is dated in 1820s. And thereafter, we found that the first mention of a group, a gongxi, is named after the deity. So is Tiang Tiang Xiangdi Gongxi is basically is Xuan Tian Sangdi Gongsi. Then there are other gongsi, Yuan Tian Sangdi Gongsi. So Xuan Tian Sangdi and Yuan Tian Sangdi, they are referring to the same deity, right? So so do we have the gongsis that is using the name of the deity to name the gongsi, right? So the other question that I have when I found out this, that then when did the name was seemingly religious in the earlier years, where Tua Lao Ya King, which is the big deity, the Yuan Tian Sangdi, Xuan Tian Sangdi is the deity name, get changed and it became Nian Gongxi or Yan Jin or Yan Gongsi, right? Which is actually a geopolitical entity back in China. It's the ancient name of the of Cao Zhou, right? And so this change from a so-called a religious nature of a gongxi to a geopolitical entity to denote a community is actually very interesting. Another thing that actually sort of interests me is the name of the temple, right? So at least we know for sure that the name Yueh Hai Ching Bio or Wak Hai Cheng Bio is inscribed on the entrance gateway of this temple. And this entrance gateway is only dated back to 1895. Was there a older entrance gateway? Is unknown, right? There's a question mark. So we can only say for sure that the name Wak Hai Cheng Bio probably dates to 1895 for sure, or probably earlier, right? So that name is also very interesting because Wak or Yue, right? It denotes again a geography, a geographical zone, which is the province of Guangdong. And in the late Qing dynasty, this Yue or Guangdong province encompasses various dialect groups, including Hainan Island. So it includes the Teochew, of course, the Cantonese, the Hakkas, and the Hainanese, right? And in fact, if you go to a temple today, inside the temple, you can see kind of plaques being presented by all these dialect groups, with the exception of the Hokkiens, because Hokkiens is not from the same province.
Right. So well, that change in name to a more geopolitical kind of imagination or consideration. Will you have more to say on that? And because earlier in my comments I mentioned how the deity and therefore the deity's name, in this case it makes sense that the early associations used the deity's name to sort of represent the community, and that has a very strong religious character to it, and we know that any sense of community is essentially religious among the early Chinese, right? So that change of name to consider a more topographical or geopolitical entity, has that got anything to do with having to negotiate with local conditions in Singapore, or say with the fact of having left China, right? Which then perhaps we can conjecture then allows them to see Jin, right, as a whole, right? Because after you leave, because if you're still inside, like what was mentioned earlier, you will still be sticking to your own like Chaoyang or Chaoan identity rather than a general Teochew identity. Will you care to comment on that?
Yes, it's still a hypothesis, which is why what this question that you asked, I did not really elaborate on in the book itself, although you can read in between the lines. The early naming of the grouping, whether in the name of the deity, right, Tua Lao Ya Geng or Xuan Tian Sang Ti Gong Si, it changed to Nian Gong Si, Yan Jin, Nian Society, Nian Gong Si. I think it got. My hypothesis is that it has two things that contribute to it: the local politics. First thing first is that there is always the clan rivalry, right? The dialect rivalry. The Hokkiens being the largest dialect community in Singapore versus the others, and other scholars have also wrote about it, that possibly because of this clan rivalry and clan politics, the Teochew started to group the other smaller dialect groups together, right? Namely, and they identify themselves as the same province, right? Right? And the same province, and you can see that in the one of the inscription on the beam, right? The Teochew identify themselves Yueh Dong, right? The people from the eastern of Yueh, right, which is the geographical. So they see themselves Yueh rather than they don't call them Cao Zhou. And so if you have more people with you, you can counteract the kind of clan rivalry of the Hokkiens as well. The second is, I think, is more towards the British administrative system. That's again my hypothesis, is that in the early days when they have names of the gongsis, right? And in the land records, it's very interesting that it's in individual names, right? The property is owned by individuals, right? And it's only much later, around 1860s, 1870s, right, that you start to see the word trustee that appeared in the land documents. And this is it started to, again, I think the early Chinese started to navigate the legal system in terms of land transfer. So how do we understand a Chinese temple, right? We always think that Chinese temple is held in trust for a certain group of people, a certain community, right? But when you come to an area that has a very different understanding of land rights, right? The land has been owned by someone. So initially, they probably put some names there, held in trust, and this has some legal issues when this particular person passed away, right? The estate of this person may contest that the land is held in trust, because on legal documents it never says it's held in trust, right? And so they'll have a lot of this kind of dispute. And the another dispute is that when people are deported from Singapore, and there are a lot of cases where by the British government deport they call undesirable aliens, right, back to China. And when these people were holding land, right, and commonly or conventionally understood that hold land in trust of a community, then what happened to these properties? So these are the kind of I think adapting to the social and even administrative systems of the population. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I guess the what I find the first point that you make, I think is especially interesting because it's the sort of appropriation of geopolitical boundaries in China to articulate, right, the kind of clan rivalries and local intra-Chinese political relations, right, in Singapore itself. And I find that really fascinating, and it shows the although this may not be like the key thrust of your book, but it does shows us clues, to some of these other implications that your book has for the social history of the Chinese in Singapore, and also the second point that you made, right, how they interact with local land laws. Let me just quickly move to another question that has been a burning question for me. The restoration project, right, for the Yueh Hai Ching Bio has won an important UNESCO award. Could you share with us very quickly some of the challenges that you face in restoring this temple, especially so many years after its last restoration?
I think the challenge is with craftsmen, right? The
Right.
lack of craftsmen. I think the lack of craftsmen in Singapore is not a recent thing. I think it's even historical, right? So I do suspect that in the 1895 reconstruction of the temple, the craftsmen were actually traveling craftsmen, imported craftsmen from China, which is to see why the kind of skill sets that is actually very, very close to that of a very good, exquisite temple in China, a Teochew temple in China. So the craftsmanship is one. The lack of craftsmanship that we have is one major challenge that we have. So how do we then restore a building? Certainly, we have to go back to China, look for Teochew craftsmen, and we have to invite them over to Singapore to restore. But having said that, I think that is still not sufficient. I think Chinese craftsmen techniques change over the years, right? With improvement to inverted commas, improvement or the rise of the modern materials, it also entered into the traditional craft. For example, the oil-based paint, craftsmen used to mix their own oil-based paint using Hong Yu, right? And then they will use iron oxide pigment and grind it up and add it into the Hong Yu to create oil-based paint. A lot of them don't do it anymore. They purchase ready-made enamel paint, right? The paint. So can all this modern material replace historic material? So this is the first question, right? How sustainable are such practices? What is the longevity of these materials on the materials that we're going to restore? So these are the various questions that are the challenges. I think one of the things that another major challenges that we face is on the approach, right? Obviously, this temple is a living temple, the temple that's still being used, right? So this temple has two personas, if I may say that. One is a religious site, and two, today, is also a heritage site, right? So as a heritage site, we want to keep as much historic fabric as possible. As a religious site, then we want the best for our deity. There is always this desire to add on ornamentation. So how do we navigate these two desires of wanting to provide more and more, right, for the building, and on the other hand, trying to keep to what is original. So I suppose that this whole process of the restoration and trying to answer these questions, right, on its role as a religious site, as well as the heritage sites, in a way guided the restoration decision. And I suppose that that was acknowledged by the jury members of UNESCO.
Okay. So given that difficulty, I mean, in both the craftsmanship and also materials, um, how do you think these issues can be resolved going forward? I suppose the restoration you were involved in is not the last restoration, and I believe the trustees would want to keep the temple in tip-top shape. So going forward, how do you think what needs to be done in order to keep the temple as an important heritage site of the Teochews in Singapore?
I think the challenges will not go away, and as you said, the challenges, the limitation or the scarcity of craftsmen remain, and not just in Singapore, in China as well. Actually, a lot of the craftsmen are reluctant to come to Singapore, right? They are so highly sought after in China. There are a lot of temples, and in fact, the wages in China are equally good, if not better, sometimes, right? So there's very little incentives for them to come. That's one, right? So we do face this challenge. And having said that, I think what is the most important thing is that then how do we go about doing? I think documentation is very important. At least we try to do whatever we can to the best of our condition and limitation. But whatever we do, we have to document it down of what sort of changes or what sort of treatment we have carried out on the artifact or the historical structures. Because having this documentation, it's important because it could be like 10 years down the road, someone may have found a better way of restoring the temple, and having known what was done 10 years ago, right, they could formulate more effective restoration treatment decisions.
Right. So I guess there's always the possible pros and cons going forward. We may not have as good access to craftsmen with the requisite skills, but on the other hand, with the advances in technology, we may end up having better materials or better techniques that can do the restoration or at least conserve what we have, the treasure that we have in Yueh Hai Ching Bio itself. Now, Kang Shua, we are coming to the end of this book launch, but I want to just throw one more question, right? It's the what's next question. So you now have this book. I don't know whether you've worked on this for like 10 years or more, right? And it's the culmination of one important part of your life, and you've reached sort of a key milestone by publishing this book. But that's not what we can expect from you, right? As a scholar, for your lifetime, I suppose we should expect more from you. So do tell us what your next great project is like, and what else we can expect from you going forward.
I think going forward, of course, certainly this book, I'm very happy that it's finally out. I've been collected lots of information here and there over the last 10 years, and I decided that I have sufficient material to put together a book, right? And like what I mentioned during our dialogue, there are still a lot of questions left unanswered, right? And all these questions, I think, will follow me, right? And again, like what you mentioned, again, with all archival research is 可遇不可求. Maybe there will be a second volume if I manage to find more information, maybe another 10 years, 20 years, who knows, right? But
we hope we wouldn't have to wait another 10 or 20 years.
Yeah, but of course, beyond Yueh Hai Ching Bio, Wak Hai Cheng Bio, right, or the Teochew communities, I'm also very interested in the early craftsmen and early designers, or inverted commas, what we call architects, right, who design and construct these buildings, right, of the 19th century, 20th century. Who are these people? So I'm embarking on a project with a colleague to look into this group of people at least the early so-called architects in the colonial period, the Europeans are relatively well known, right? Relatively well documented. The Asians or the non-Europeans, the Chinese, the Malays, or the occasional Indians who have left names in the archival building plan. Who are these people? We only have a name, right? But what is the background? What is the bibliographical sketch? We seems to have very little information about these people. Where were they educated, right? Are they formally schooled in architecture or in construction technique, or they actually learn through the ranks? So these are the questions that I have, having worked on Yueh Hai Ching Temple, Wak Hai Cheng Bio, this book, and these are the various questions that I would like to expand to the rest of the Singapore, to the essentially non-Europeans builders of our built environment of the 19th and 20th century.
Right, so there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, a preview of Kang Shua's next project and perhaps his next book, which we hope will not take another 10 years to come out. And you have granted us the preview of your book today as well, right, on divine custody. And I would like to just make a pitch to the audience. If you would like to have a discount to purchase this book, you get 20% off if you follow the instructions on the Facebook page for this for the purchase of this book. So, Kang Shua, can you show us as well? Okay. So and it's hardcover. So I'll show you with many pictures. And it's definitely worth a buy if you get 20% off. I think it's a real money's worth for it. Thank you very much, Kang Shua, for the double preview today. We hope that it won't be too long before you have your next book launch. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you also for joining us today for the book launch. And I hope that you all have a good weekend and evening. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Yew Foong, for the wonderful as a moderator, discussant, as well as salesman for my book. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. See you soon.
See you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Okay.